Welcome. Welcome to Massey College and welcome to this series on ethics. It's a great pleasure to do this series that has forced us to reflect on some of the big questions around our society. And today we're talking about corruption, the blight of corruption, and whether or not we need an international anti corruption court. But first, let me acknowledge that this is taking place on Massey College, which is on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So I'm very grateful to Tom Axworthy and his team to have put together a fabulous series on ethics. And I'm particularly interested in today because I think we know how much corruption has undermined human rights efforts and development efforts around the world. So without further ado, Tom.
Well, good morning and good afternoon. The subject of corruption and what to do about it is very much on the world's agenda. President Biden, who is planning a Democratic summit next week, has put efforts at anti-corruption on that agenda. Recent reports by the World Bank have talked about the billions and possibly even trillions of dollars in development assistance, which ends up in Swiss bank accounts. The United Nations has a convention against corruption, which most nations in the world have signed. But as with many of these conventions, implementation is a tremendous issue and difficulty. So to raise this issue, we have a very interesting and distinguished panel today. Robert Cribb from the Toronto Star has been part of the Star team who joined with colleagues around the world on the release of the Pandora Papers. 12 million files and perhaps counting have already had some startling revelations about the networks and some very prominent Canadians involved in this. This is very important investigative reporting work. Um, and I'd like to start with you, Robert, to ask you, so what did you learn from this latest set of revelations? What does it tell us about corruption around the world? And has Canada really done anything about it in any significant way?
I mean, I think what it tells us is that it's thriving and burgeoning as it ever was, despite the fact that this is part of a trilogy. Of course, this is the third major global international leak. Started in 2017 with the Panama Papers, and then a couple of years later, the Paradise Papers. So this is really the third iteration of massive leaks. In total, 30 million documents have been leaked to journalists in that time. And so, starting several years ago, we've been writing about the scourge of tax avoidance and evasion, the impacts here at home, the billions of dollars siphoned out of tax coffers every year that would otherwise go to building hospitals and daycares and bridges and roads, and how those among us who are most equipped to contribute to the collective are also most equipped to avoid contributing to the collective. And the latest iteration simply shows that it continues very much unabated. When these flare-ups occur and journalists get hold of these records, of course, there is tremendous concern expressed by political leaders and commitments to address it. I think what these latest records show is that it's not been effective, clearly. And many of the steps that 5 years ago Prime Minister Trudeau committed to, and to some extent, executed on, made real financial commitments to beefing up CRA accounting scrutiny. But it just feels like a tiny little cork in the dam that is overflowing. So we see from these latest revelations, there's thousands of Canadians in these documents with thousands of companies tucked away in tax havens totally protected jurisdictions that exist to protect secrecy and to allow the movement of billions of dollars. In some cases, legally, because which raises very interesting legal questions about why that might be, given what we might all agree to be the ethics of that and the impact on the collective public interest. But also in many cases, what we found we believe to be illegal. We're journalists. We can't declare it to be illegal. Ultimately, courts have to do that. And the likelihood that any of this will end up before the courts are infinitesimal for sure. And so it's a pretty great system for those who wish to avoid an evade.
Well, we'll certainly be coming back to you to even get more detail. The papers and your stories show that corruption is not just an issue abroad. We have many Canadians who are part of the network, either in tax avoidance or in helping money laundering across systems and so on. So let's turn to our second guest, Senator Ratna Omidvar, who has had a very distinguished career working on refugees and immigration and multiculturalism over many years, a tremendous advocate, and now, happily for all of us in the Senate, independent senator from Ontario. And Ratna, among the many initiatives you're working on, one that jumped out at me, and you've written op-eds, I think, in the Star or the Globe on it as well, is the repurposing of foreign assets from these kleptomaniacs and these dictators. We just talked to Robert about the papers which showed Canadian contributions to the networks. But with your work on refugees, the World Refugee Council, how widespread a problem is the issue of kleptomania among authoritarians and dictators? And tell us about your bill, which you've just reintroduced into the Senate. We'll be speaking on shortly to try to do something about it, to toughen up what Canada might do about this issue.
Precisely, and thank you to you, Tom, and to Massey College for hosting this timely conversation, especially in response to the papers that have been, the different Paradise, Panama, Pandora papers that have been worked at by the fantastic group of journalists, including the Toronto Star. So yes, I retabled the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act in the Senate. I spoke to it, I believe, in the last parliament. It didn't get traction because of prorogation. It's a very imaginative proposal, and I want to give full credit to my colleagues at the World Refugee and Migration Council for conceiving of this and analyzing it, and in particular Alan Rock, who is, we all know, former Canadian ambassador to the UN. So what will this bill do? It's not a global effort. It's a Canadian effort. If the bill is called into law, Canada will be able to not just freeze the assets of corrupt foreign officials and kleptocrats, as it currently does under various sanction regimes, including Magnitsky, but it will be able to seize them through court order and repurpose them back to those who have been harmed most by the actions of these kleptocrats. So it's important for obvious reasons. For one, I'm going to focus on the forced displacement calamity. There are over 82 million people around the world, and the number keeps increasing with every crisis that we hear about. Half of them are children who have fled their homes because of armed conflict, violence, persecution. They are vulnerable victims for sexual trafficking and sexual exploitation. And this, by the way, is the highest number of the forcibly displaced since the Second World War. So I come at this also from personal lived experience. I'm one of those unfortunate ones, I would say, who had to make the decision to leave Iran literally in the middle of the night. And the decision to flee is never an easy one. It is fraught with peril, and frankly, it paralyzes you, and you know the whole world is changing around you, and you don't quite know what awaits you on the other side. And I share this story with the academics and the students in the room because I need you to walk in the shoes of the people who feel their fear, their loss, and their helplessness. Now, I'm really lucky. I'm really lucky because I was able to come to Canada. This is not the case for many people who are forced to flee. The displaced people in the world today live in squalor, little food, fresh water is scarce, disease is rampant. Think about COVID. Sex and human trafficking are rampant industries. And resettlement, a feature that Canada is rightfully proud of. But when you look at the actual numbers, the numbers of resettled refugees in the world applies to a slim 10% of the world's refugee population. And it doesn't include the world's displaced population because many of them are internally displaced. So let's think of Bangladesh, which is hosting, somewhat unwillingly, Rohingya refugees, Uganda hosting South Sudanese, Colombia, which has absorbed a huge number of refugees from Venezuela, and now Pakistan with the Afghan refugees. And all have needed to open their doors, some willingly, some unwillingly, at great cost to their own economy and their own social fabric. The other reason I want to focus on forced displacement is because it is no longer a temporary phenomenon. On average, it lasts 20 years. So whole generations of human beings know nothing more about a normal existence because they live in a protracted, uncertain life. So what can we do about it? Clearly, the UNHCR is still our most effective international response. But as the World Refugee Council has pointed out again and again, there is simply not enough money in the system. So we need more money in the system to respond to these crises. And yet, we also know there's a whole lot of corrupt money floating around the world. The World Bank estimates that this amount could be $20 to $40 billion. And this is stolen from development assistance, and it is stolen by public officials in these corrupt countries. And according to the UN Secretary General, embezzlement, tax dodging, bribes, and payoffs cost $3.6 million. And even more pertinently, it is estimated that corrupt leaders of countries with large numbers of refugees or displacement have deposited billions of dollars in cash in foreign jurisdiction. So I think it is reasonable to assume, it is reasonable to be somewhat certain that some of this money is parked right here in Canada because of our reputation in financial good governance. So we need accountability and we need justice. We need justice by not just freezing the assets, which we do, but seizing them and repurposing them back through court order to support those whose lives have been uprooted. We need due process, and I do not believe this should be a political decision. So my bill proposes that the seizure of assets of corrupt foreign officials take place through court order. Only a judge should decide, based on the balance of evidence provided, whether to proceed on the matter or not. And we need transparency. At this point, we have a list of names whose assets have been frozen, such as the Magnitsky list, but we actually don't know if they have assets in the country. And my bill will mandate the creation of a frozen assets registry, which would be hugely complemented if the government comes through with the beneficial ownership registry. Those two go hand in hand. So, this is my bill. Canada should not be a safe haven for ill-gotten gains. It sends a strong message to corrupt leaders. You and your money are not welcome in this country. This is not a place where you can have it. So that's my bill. and I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Let's turn now to Mary Jane Bennett, who's a prominent litigator, has appeared before our own Supreme Court, but also has been a national regulator on the Transport Board, and so knows the ins and outs of how to you look at a regulatory policy when there's a need for the public good. So you've just heard Mary Jane, and we'll come back to some of these points. A description of a Canadian network around tax avoidance, and then Ratna has described the vast amounts of money that authoritarians have been able to squirrel away. So, and she's proposing a bill on this. So I'm turning to you now. Legally, what is your reaction and response to both the Canadian issue and the international issue? Do we need, for example, a new international institution, an anti-corruption court similar to the International Criminal Court? The International Criminal Court does not have grand corruption as one of its missions, so it can't be used. Is there a need for a new international mechanism, or what insights do you have that what can be done both nationally and internationally?
Thanks, Tom, and thank you to Massey College for having this debate. It may be the nature of the topic, an international criminal court, or it may be my legal background, but I've prepared some notes, so I hope you'll allow me a reference to them. I begin by referring to the small island of Niue off the coast of New Zealand, population 1,600, and it held 9,000 offshore companies, mostly Russian, during its heyday. Billions flowed through each month. Here in Canada, reports are that 10 billion in house sales over a period of time. There were no no known owners. A similar amount of cash deals occurred. 25% of house sales in California are cash sales. And in its submission to the Cullen Commission, that perhaps you're aware that BC is in the throes of investigating money laundering in the province, brought on by common knowledge to the fact that hockey bags of cash were being brought into local casinos. So in that submission, the Government of Canada submitted that mortgage fraud and other legal activities contribute to spiraling housing costs. One report is that 5.3 billion had been laundered in BC in recent years. Corruption, as Senator Omidvar has pointed out, destabilizes countries, making it easier for authoritarian regimes to corrupt democratic governance, often leading to outward migration, or as she calls it, rightfully, forced displacement. In Afghanistan, fraud by public officials with billions in development money led to what former Global Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy referred to as undermining institutions and leading to the rise of the Taliban militant political organization. It then becomes a global security concern. So there's limited number of tools to deal with corruption. It affects us all. And because there are this limited number of tools, it becomes difficult to arrest it. While the tools have brought some benefit, each one is restricted. And in my opinion, the only way to move forward is with an international anti-corruption court. One tool is in the US is the use of Senate hearings, and they have brought about great changes. In 2009, they shed light on Swiss banking secrecy and led to the examination of bearer certificates. The bearer certificates are literally a piece of paper that says whoever owns this piece of paper is the owner of the property. So after the bearer certificate issues, it's impossible to know who the owner of the property is. And over the next decade, countries after the Senate hearing began legislating against bearer certificates, but they simply moved on, often back to Panama, which is the country where the corruption began. And similarly with the 2010 Senate hearings into HSBC and its purchase of a Mexican bank that had become the go-to bank for cartels. HSBC's head of compliance, while testifying, quit while testifying. Assets were frozen, and it prompted other HSBC branches to begin to disclose voluntarily. Another tool is the use of in the U.S. is the use of a John Doe summons, which literally is issued by the IRS upon grant of approval by a judge. And in 2019, a Texas district court judge allowed its use against a law firm in order to gain access to its list, where it had surfaced that the law firm had been engaged in setting up trusts and other illicit corporations in order to avoid taxes. So the largest weapon in the arsenal is what Jake Bernstein refers to in his book Secrecy World as journalistic firepower. It's the work done by journalists in uncovering offshore data and exposing the breadth of the problem. So there are these limited means of dealing with it, and each has at one point a series of legislation, regulation has followed, and that's been somewhat successful, but there are problems with it. First, a patchwork or a hodgepodge of legislation exists then around the globe and even domestically. Here in Canada, recent legislative frameworks either exclude or include real estate from regulatory oversight. Thus, BC has created a land ownership transparency registry in order to try and deal with the fact that some registrations are done without any knowledge as to who the owner is. That's currently absent in Ontario. The Business Corporations Act itself shields the identity of beneficial owners, allowing trusts and other global partnerships, etc., to emerge. In fact, it bears witness to the claim that in some jurisdictions it's easier to get a library card or to register a company than it is to get a library card. Often justice is actively discouraged as well. So therefore you've got offshore, when in 1972 the offshore accounts of President Nixon, Bibi Rebozo, even Creedence Clearwater Revival surfaced through journalistic efforts. It became a case, according to Blankstein, of the dog catches the car and gets run over. The IRS investigation was quashed, and employees risked suicide or employment suicide if they pursued it any further. So the third problem with these kind of ad hoc investigations are that money moves on. In reaction to increased diligence in the British Virgin Islands and the loss of banking secrecy in Switzerland, money found new homes in Dubai, Singapore, and now Canada. We've got to realize that the money is here, the corruption is here on our shores. The conclusion then is that corruption is a global concern and can only be tackled as such, giving rise to the push for a forum to criminalize grand corruption, being the International Anti-Corruption Court. The court would operate on the principle of complementarity, which means that only those countries that are unwilling or unable to prosecute grand corruption would be subject to prosecution. It would have many benefits, one being that it would strengthen the capacity of nations to combat corruption and would encourage compliance. It would address a further problem with the current system in that it would employ an elite group of financial experts that can trace these often very complex money transactions. Novelist Simona Weinglass says that countries that allow financial corruptions on their shore enter into a devil's bargain. While economies grow and real estate prices swell, corruption spreads. What is left is not what was there before. To the tiny island of Niue, many of its former employees that were in the banking industry then turned to sex phoning for their livelihood. Thanks, Tom.
Well, Mary Jane, very comprehensive. Good. Well, let's have a second round now, and members of the panel can make comments on any of the points that have been raised. Robert, I wanted to go back to you because you had mentioned, and others have as well, that when we look at this issue of offshore accounts, that as revealed by journalists, that other jurisdictions, the UK and several other countries, have gone after these offshore folks initially revealed by the Panama Papers, and got quite a bit of the money, not all of it, but significant amounts back. And yet, I believe I'm correct that the CRA said this summer that they haven't laid a single charge yet on this. Can you give us your views on what is behind that? We have such a large deficit. Other countries have been going to ill-gotten gains to get it back, and yet there seems to be a lethargy there. I'd like to ask your view and then go to the senator as well.
Yeah, this is all really disheartening. We are laggards internationally on this issue, and continue to be. It's very puzzling to me. Every step along the way has been difficult. You know, from the moment we published the Panama Papers, we didn't just publish it. You know, all of the issues with the movement of the money offshore and the losses and the gains. We actually laid out, you know, all of the ways which other countries are addressing this. Things like beneficial registry, which have been mentioned here today, greater enforcement, strategic targeted enforcement. And, you know, something as simple as measuring the tax gap. This country didn't measure the tax gap until 2-3 years ago, and it was because of relentless pressure from my newspaper and I think others to just, like, can we not get a number? Can we not just, until there's a number, how can you even argue for, you know, public policy changes? And then, you know, so reluctantly, begrudgingly, we sort of slouched forward behind everybody else. There's now a commitment on a beneficial registry, but we are in no way leading the pack on that. It feels like sort of there's this inherent pressure that's emerged because so many other countries are now committing to this. So it's puzzling. You know, the CRA itself calculates as much as $15 billion in tax revenue is lost annually to offshore tax havens. Think about what we would do with $15 billion that just emerged by addressing this issue. What we could do in terms of infrastructure and healthcare. And then if you look at what other countries, since Panama Papers, almost $1.4 billion US has been recovered by governments around the world. This is through opening investigations, prosecuting. Canada, you know what the number is? You want to take a guess?
10? 10
million?
Zero
penny.
Zero. Yeah, I know
so
that.
So the CRA cannot confirm a single penny has been recovered. There's been no charges laid. So you tell me. I mean, that it is a stark comparison with much of the rest of the Western world and beyond the Western world even. So it's very disheartening, and you know, these are questions that we continue to ask and pose to political leaders, and we are reassured that it is of high priority, and the fairness of the tax system is of utmost importance to this government, and yet here we are. There's the deeds action chasm is vast and expanding.
Ratna, could you comment on this? I mean, these are fairly shocking things that Robert has just said about lethargy with clear
Yes.
malfeasance.
Yes, they are. And this issue has been raised in the Senate time and time again, particularly by Senator Down, who is from Prince Edward Island. Um, and it is true that we have just recovered $0. My understanding is that one of the reasons we have discovered $0 is that most of these people who have put their money in other jurisdictions, protecting their assets in different ways and foregoing tax revenues, are so wealthy. They have so much firepower of their own that any legal action by the CRA is countered by very sophisticated legal interventions on their behalf. And therein may be a nub of the problem. I think the work Robert and others are doing is the lever that we need to continue to add to our arsenal. And I don't think we have discussed the arsenal in Canada appropriately or completely. And I think naming and shaming people, that's what we need to do.
Well, what would it take to add to the arsenal? This could be for any member of the panel. What what more do we need? We've got investigative journalism, and they're certainly continuing at it and doing a worldwide service. You've raised a bill about foreign assets in the Senate. You've talked about colleagues in the Senate to try to make this issue more prominent. Mary Jane, you've talked about several American examples of differing approaches in the U.S. What what would be a good and comprehensive anti-corruption policy to 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 fill out that arsenal so that we had all the tools that we needed to try to regroup the money and bring some equity and bring some justice to bear on this. What's missing from Canada? Is it only political will, or do we need legislation, regulation, and so on? Who'd like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. There's never, of course, one answer. There's an array of issues that need to be addressed. Greater enforcement. There has to be a true will, and there has to be real money behind the CRA and the prosecution and the availability of the resources. Because it's absolutely true that the people that we write about and the people who are doing this are well equipped to hire, the Bay Street law firms to tackle this stuff. And there's no question. We've been told this sort of off the record by CRA officials that it's definitely one of the challenges. The going after the low hanging fruit, the guy with the corner store who may or may not have, not paid $100 in taxes is a way more fruitful endeavor than going up against a billionaire who can throw a team of lawyers at it and end up, a case that's going to go on for you. So there's no question about that. And so what's the answer? You throw up your hands and go, oh, well, we're just going to go after the little guys? Or do you actually arm up and spend real money and do the right thing? It's the right thing to do for the country, for the economics of this country. And, for ethical reasons, this is an ethical series. There's no question in my mind that this is the right thing to do. But the other thing I'll say is, just sort of think about this from a criminal point of view. What is the number one tool for those who wish to illegally evade taxes? What's the number one? What are they looking for when they go to the BVI or Panama? Why would they do that? What are they going there for? They're going there for one thing. The number one tool is secrecy. This is the golden scepter. So they seek secrecy. So what do? One thing you do is you remove that tool. So in this country, we can do that through beneficial ownership means, because Canada, as I think somebody mentioned, is becoming a target for the world. Canada is seen as a remarkable place to come dump your money because it's got a great reputation internationally, and yet it is shrouded in secrecy. You have to be more transparent to get a library card in this country than to set up a corporation with legal front, straw man directors. You can do this entirely anonymously. And the world has figured this out. There's websites around the world with a maple leaf emblazoned on them saying, let us set up your tax structure in Canada, which of course doesn't hold any of the stigma of a tax haven and yet brings them many of the same benefits. So a real beneficial ownership registry, which removes the secrecy, which should have never existed. It's totally puzzling why this would be secret information. This is phone book information, name of the company, the real owner, address, contact information. This is what we need. And so while there's been an admission officially that we're going to adopt a beneficial registry, there's lots of ways to do a beneficial registry. There's the right way, and then there's the wrong way. It should be public. It should be the same as the British model. It's a website where any one of us, from investigative journalists to members of the public to researchers, go on the registry, look up Tom Axworthy, and find out the companies that are associated with you to which you are a real beneficial owner. And, so that's the domestic element of what we can do. And then, of course, internationally, as Ms. Bennett just pointed out, as long as there's an island somewhere or a state somewhere that's trying to attract this business by removing transparency and allowing for there to be tax advantages that amount to zero, then that the money will go there. And so there has to be, on an international scale, widespread collaborative approaches that ultimately weed out all of the opportunities to seek out the dark corners where you can do this.
I have to say it'd be a pretty thin list if my name was on it. But Mary Jane, Robert's just talked about international collaboration around transparency, and in your notes to us and talk to us, when you talked about the possibility of an international anti-corruption court, that also, of course, requires states to agree. The problem of creating international institutions, of course, is to getting state buy-in, and particularly it's been so difficult with the United States often being opposed to any new international bodies. Is the idea of an international anti-corruption court, however useful, and it was in both the Liberal and Conservative Party platforms this year, so that's important, I think, for a Canadian commitment. But what are the chances, do you think, of getting enough agreement to create this new international institution? How hard is that going to be?
Well, there definitely exist jurisdictional hurdles, but I completely agree with what Robert Cribb has said, that what you're faced with grand corruption is they will loot, and then move the money to another country. So you've got to tackle it both domestically and internationally. And we can tighten things domestically, but we've got to do more than that. And that is the advantage when you see how few weapons we have at our disposal in order to meet, requirements of natural justice, et cetera, and a balance on beyond a reasonable doubt, which would be the criminal standard for any prosecution. So we've got all of these limitations. So the International Criminal Court is one that allows us the best way to tackle corruption, grand corruption, on an international scale. And yes, there are hurdles. There's, I'd call them jurisdictional hurdles. It's either, the jurisdictional hurdles are that the International Anti-Corruption Court would have to be part of the Conference Against Corruption. That's part of the UN and WTO deals where money for foreign aid, etc., are part and parcel, but they cannot amend themselves. So there's a basic problem, jurisdictional hurdle initially. There are means of getting around that. And one method put forward is that make this part of the International Criminal Court. And their basis of their jurisdiction is such that it would suggest that we could do that by expanding their jurisdiction to include an anti-corruption element to it. But just dealing with it like this, money moves on. We can chase it away, but then it does become, as Minister Axworthy had noticed, had remarked, it becomes a matter of global security at some point. So we're all in it together. This is an international as well as a domestic issue where we all have to face this.
Well, when we talk that we all have to face it, though, I mean, Ratna brought up and Robert verified that there seems to be such an imbalance of power in terms of legal resources or expertise. I mean, Ratna, can it be that protectors of their privilege can have more legal power than the CRA or the government of Canada? I'd like to hear just more from you about this imbalance issue.
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? That $0 have been recovered. So clearly they have more firepower. But I will propose something new. And in addition to the beneficial ownership registry, I do think that we should also go after the intermediaries. After all, the intermediaries provide the advice, they provide the pathways, and we know from the Panama and Pandora papers that there are institutional advisors in this space, and we should make it illegal for them through the criminal code, illegal for them to provide such advice, be they consultants, be they lawyers, be they financial planners, be they financial consultants, and if they do so, their license could be in danger of revocation. We've got to arm ourselves a tad better. And I completely agree that with Mary Jane, we need to look at this in an international level through multilateralism, but we also need to give teeth to our own domestic capacity to catch these, bad guys. So I think all provinces should have a housing registry, and possibly the federal government, which is tabling a housing bill shortly, could be persuaded to have the framework for such a housing registry that, I know federal, provincial bickering will take over, but a federal framework on a housing registry may also be the right way forward. So I think we need to be creative, and certainly the bill that I'm proposing is an imaginative proposal, as I said, because it would hurt them where they hurt most, which is taking their money and repurposing it back through a transparent court order process. I understand there's a question in the chat about how do you prevent that this money doesn't get corrupted again. Well, I think that is a very good question. We've had some negative experience in this light. Many years ago, we had, I think, $8 billion, I forget the right amount of money, located in this country from Muammar Gaddafi. And when the regime fell, that money was restored to the next Libyan government, and there is no way of knowing whether it was corrupted again or not. So I think we need to be very careful with restitution. And restitution can at some point, at some time, be to the country. In the case of my bill, it is the judge who will decide. It is the judge who will decide after hearing from witnesses and civil society institutions who may have an interest in the repurposed money, whether it goes back to the country, whether it goes to a neighboring country, such as in the case of Venezuela, should it be repurposed back to Colombia to help Colombia with the millions of people who are displaced, whether it goes back to a more neutral third party like the World Bank or the UNHCR or even an NGO like the Médecins Sans Frontières. What's key is that the court order will also provide a framework for accounting back to the court how this money was spent. So there is far greater transparency in this bill for the tricky business of restitution. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, you've mentioned, Ratna, your colleagues in the Senate who are interested in this. I just wonder, in the other house, do you know, are there MPs
Yes.
interested? Is there an anti-corruption caucus?
Yes.
There are democracy caucuses and so on. Is there the beginning of a building of a movement, multi-party, around this issue, do you think?
There is. I'll give you an indicator of that. This bill, the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, was in the party platform of the Liberals in the 2018. It is in the party platform of the Conservatives going into this parliament. So there is political wind behind it one way or another. A private member's bill is we all know what it is. It is to raise awareness and to prod and push both the government and the opposition. In a minority government, it actually opens up all kinds of opportunities. So I am dedicated to moving this forward beyond the Senate into the House of Commons as soon as I can.
Excellent, good. Well, one last point that I wanted to bring up, our time is starting to run out. Several of you, I think all of you, have mentioned one way or the other, those who collaborate with the bad guys, the financial advisors, the bankers, the whole set of networks which make this happen. And the thought certainly struck me that if one could make an impact in Bay Street in New York, London, Switzerland, to bring the ethics of this to bear on those financial capitals, is there a way to do that? Is it only really naming and shaming that Ratna talked about and Robert's research is doing? What can be done to, we've been talking about government and public policy, what can be done about the internal ethical mechanisms, if they exist, among those financial communities which are so intricately involved in what they are doing? Is there a way to make morality part of the financial system, or is that utopian?
I mean, it's utopian, but if you think about deterrence, right? So, what deters the very people that you're talking about? I think illegality clearly is a deterrent.
Okay.
What exists now is, and I'm not a lawyer, but we've spent lots of time laying out before very senior economists and lawyers the documents that we receive and analyze and look at, and we put to them the details, and ultimately the question emerges, okay, so here's what they're doing, here's the strategy, here's the movement, here's the layering of companies in 5 different jurisdictions in order to create an opaqueness. Got it. I understand how it works. Next question, is it illegal? And one would think on its face that that's a binary question, right? Yes or no. Is this illegal? And what we've learned in 5-6 years of working on these things is that it's almost never a simple yes. It is so complicated. It deals with the legal system sometimes of 4 different jurisdictions. Where the place where the mind and management is taking place is often vague. And so ultimately the smartest people on the planet, and we've talked to them all, when you lay all this out for them, ultimately they say, I think it is. But ultimately, the answer to that question can only be determined in a court of law by a judge. And so one thing that strikes me is on this question of, is it illegal, is it not illegal? Because certainly the folks in London and Bay Street and Wall Street will and everybody and the CEOs of the companies that we go to and put to our findings, they will say we follow the law, we follow the law, and they have an argument. They have an argument. Mm. So greater clarity, if we actually believe that what is happening here is unethical and wrong and counter to the public interest that we all share, greater clarity, which means ultimately legislative reform, legislative change, or greater legislative precision, is ultimately the answer, it seems to me, in terms of the deterrence. So that there is greater certainty that if you do this, if you take the advice of what we call facilitators, these are the lawyers and the accountants that ultimately grant access to this world of secrecy that most of us don't have access to. If you go down that road, you're doing so with the knowledge that it's not gray, it's very clear. If you do this, it is illegal, and you will face the potential repercussions of that. That does not exist now. There is enough gray, believe me, so that there is a confidence and certainty, which is behind the outflow of billions of dollars from this country into tax havens. I mean, if there was certainty on this, surely there would be some focusing of the mind, some second thought about it. But there really isn't. And it's because there is a great degree of confidence that there's enough gray here to be okay.
May I add something to that, Thomas, very quickly?
Please.
Since
Sure.
I am speaking from the belly of the beast here in Ottawa,
Yeah, right.
I'll point out that the tax code has not been reviewed since 1968.
Amen.
And the tax code is the source of much frustration, but it would be really useful for either the House of Commons or the Senate to study the tax code through the lens of corruption, have people like Robert and Mary Jane come and testify and provide clarity so that recommendations can be made. And as you know, Thomas, and hopefully other people know, that the House of Commons studies and Senate studies do carry weight and do gather wind behind their back. And I think it is high time we did this. So I would ask Robert, since he's a journalist and has the power of the pen and the newspapers, is to actually, maybe work with some tax specialists and do sort of a straw man almost of where the real challenges and obstructions in the tax code lie. That would be a great thing to do as a next step.
Mary Jane, just to have your final comments as well, but there's also a specific question has come in from our Massey audience, which is that we've talked about the capacity problem of the CRA in dealing with this issue of tax avoidance in Canada, but do we have a similar capacity problem internationally? And you've raised the idea of the International Anti-Corruption Court. Is there enough firepower in terms of forensic accountants and people who have to follow? It's like detective work. Is there anywhere internationally where that is located? And if not, do we need to build that?
I think, first of all, I wanted to mention that sometimes these illegal schemes get caught up, like the Price Waterhouse investigation, that where they were receiving, I think, approvals from the regulator in Luxembourg, where a lot of the money flows, the illicit money flows end up. They were receiving an indication that everything was fine to a huge extent every day, to the point where the point was made that this was impossible to say that was a correct ruling. And as a result, that investigation, that accounting firm was seriously reprimanded. But on the wider question that you're asking, do we have sufficient forensic accountants and the like. I think we probably have some. Is it sufficient to know all of the schemes that are going on in countries around the world? I don't think so. And that is the benefit of the Anti-Corruption International Court, is that you would have access to those knowledgeable in those differing countries of what is legal and what is not legal. As one author put forward, between tax avoidance, which is legal, and tax evasion is the thickness of a jail cell, which means basically that it's sometimes hard to tell. So the more we can learn through the auspices of forensic teams around the world, the better off we'd be.
And just lastly, Mary Jane, Robert's talked about the gray area in law, and I know in your own career you've spent considerable time also with legal aid, which is trying to balance domestically those who can't have legal representation. That's an attempt at equity in our legal system. One of the themes that's come out of the discussion today, and you're a prominent lawyer, is the inequality in our legal system in terms of resources of the powerful having so much, and even the public authorities perhaps not having enough. As a lawyer, how do you respond to this equity in law issue, which we're talking about in the corruption specifics, but also has broader implications? The powerful always have the best lawyers and they usually win. Do we just have to live with that?
Well, it becomes in these kind of technical areas, and I've seen it in regulation elsewhere, is that when it becomes a very difficult issue and you have a judge that is perhaps not knowledgeable exactly how an airline operates and can get caught up in certain functions that occur as to exactly what is going on. That's why, for example, in CRTC and immigration, etc., we've got a federal court that deals with these specifics, because each one of these industries, like immigration, transportation, communication, taxation, they're all something that require a specialty. So that if we could expand the specialty by internationally finding out how does Belgium operate, what is considered legal, illegal there, and that would be with the international court, you'd get a really good forensic team. You would be able to understand how these processes work around the world, and you'd be able to tackle them. And through work like that done by Robert Cribbs, you would get some notoriety. People are not aware of that Canada has now firmly a jurisdiction where grand corruption occurs. And 5.3 billion in home sales recently were tied to cash sales, illicit money. It's a real problem, and Vancouver and Toronto are known as having some of the highest prices in the world, and it's all part of that. And as that journalist Weinglass says, we might really enjoy that benefit of the house going up in value. But coming back to your question about legal aid and the poor, we got to remember that housing prices in Canada are now out of reach for the average person in many cities.
All right. Well, I want to thank the panel very much for this discussion. It's a very robust discussion, and several excellent ideas have been raised in terms of new to fill in that arsenal. It might be a good thing for Massey College to bring together a little working group.
Yes.
Starting from this and pulling this all together and try to put our intellectual firepower behind this issue to add to the efforts of Robert and others who are raising it publicly, and you're trying to do it in the Senate. So there's an offer from Massey that we should do as well. All right. Thank. Excellent session.